Hey, did you manage the other email?
I saw your email. It's not working still.
Okay.
So keeps on taking me to
I just sent you another one.
Okay, all right.
Okay, why don't we try that one? Uh-huh. Okay, so we have
the registration again.
Okay, so let's
I don't know. I emailed myself to get to a different place. So
let me just try to find your email for a second. And Gabriela, answering your Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Okay, perfect. So looks like all right. Yeah. All right, perfect. Looks like we have an all group right now with a little bit technical difficulties. Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Marchant, we have everybody online. So I think we're good to start our conference. Let me display the slides so we can that part. This. All right. I hope you guys see my slides, just to confirm, or the small slide? Big slides. Okay, so my name is Chris Radansky. I'm the president of the Society for Healthcare Innovation. Today I have a pleasure with the University of California at Santa Cruz to present one of the series that we cover artificial intelligence. We have two fantastic speakers. And today what we're going to discuss the application of the AI in the healthcare. I'm going to hand this over to my co-host and co-moderator, Dr. Camps. Dr. Camps is the provost at University of California at Santa Cruz, and he is one of the persons who is instrumental in organizing this meeting. Dr. Camps?
Thank you very much. Well, today, as you know, we're going to talk about we're going to cover the issue of artificial intelligence. Which is the ability to make predictions and has the potential to revolutionize the practice of medicine. AI-based interpretation of some clinical tests is already performing at levels comparable to doctors and will likely continue to improve their healthcare delivery. Apart from direct patient care, AI offers increased efficiency, supply and resource management, and risk management optimization. However, due to its potential to cause major disruptions in the healthcare delivery, the use of AI in medicine needs a comprehensive ethical examination with input from all stakeholders, considering that ethical implementation is the foundation of trust. So today we're going to examine some of these issues. I'd like to introduce the two moderators. The first one is Gabriela Zarate, MBA, MHCI. She's an entrepreneur, executive, and investor with 25-year US and international career in creating and leading new ventures in healthcare, tech, and biotechnology. She's currently CEO of Health Semantics. She held executive positions at SoftBank, IBM, and Tiaxa. With a multidisciplinary background in innovation, engineering, healthcare, and translational research, her current focus is on developing technologies and scientific collaborations. Our other moderator is going to be Krzysztof Laudansky. He's an MD, PhD, and MHCI. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesiology and Clinical Care at the University of Pennsylvania. He's board certified in both anesthesiology and clinical and critical care, and he's a fellow of critical care medicine. His interests focus on the impact of critical care on the immune system, the epigenetic regulation of the immune system on homeostasis, sepsis, and post-operative recovery and cognitive decline. He established a startup in nanotechnology and AI. Chris holds degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Warsaw. I also would like to introduce the two organizations that co-sponsor this conference. The first one is SHCI, so the Society for Healthcare Innovation. So this is a group of stakeholders interested in how new technologies are going to change the delivery of healthcare. They try to be one step ahead, looking at the technologies that are going to change healthcare and seeing what the ethical implications are ahead of time. I serve as provost of Crown College at UCSC, the University of California, Santa Cruz. And Crown is one of the 10 colleges on campus. Our theme is examining the impact of emerging technologies on society. And we have a center that examines the ethics and values of advanced technologies. And we also have an organization called Get Virtual that uses new technologies to assist local businesses. So Chris and Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let's go to the next step. So what's our format? So our format is that we are having the quick introduction. Then we're going to have a presentation. Each of the presenters will present their own slides. Then we have a moderator-led discussion, which we're going to utilize, in which we're going to utilize pieces that were brought to us during the registration. Sometimes we do the breakout session, but if we feel that the discussion is flowing right, we will continue on with the questions from the audience. We will close our conversation around 3:30, 3:35. Now, a couple rules of engagement. So one thing, please remember, mute your audio. Make sure that you position correctly into the camera. It's best to minimize what's behind you or around you. Sometimes when we try to present, there's a car driving behind the window and make a lot of noise. So please be aware of that as well. We have a certain guidelines that we follow in the breakout room. It's best if the people are respectful to each other. If you would like to raise any issue, the best way is to put this into our chat or raise your hand. The one and the most important thing to remember is that this presentation is actually recorded twice. One, the presentation is being actively streamlined on the website to our patrons. The second thing, this presentation is going to be recorded and then processed and share on our website and University of California, Santa Cruz, where you can review it. Saying all of the above, if there's any problem, please let us know. I'm going to hand this to Gabriela right now to present two of our wonderful speakers. Gabriela?
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the introductions before. Gary Marchand is Regents Professor and Lincoln Professor of Emerging Technologies, Law and Ethics, and the Faculty Director of the Center of Law, Science and Innovation at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law in Arizona State University. His degrees include a PhD in genetics from the University of British Columbia, a JD in law from Harvard Law School, and an MPP in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government. He teaches, researches, and speaks about the governance of a variety of emerging technologies, including biotechnologies, genomics, neuroscience, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and blockchain. He's an elected lifetime member of the American Law Institute and a fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Science. He has served on 6 National Academy of Sciences Studies committees, and he's currently chair of the IEEE P2863 working group developing a standard for the governance of AI by entities. So welcome, Dr. Marchand. Now, Dr. Alpin Patel is a physician engineer, informatician, active teacher, and researcher. He has a particular interest in machine and deep learning, in mathematical modeling of biological processes, informatics, and 3D printing. Dr. Patel is the chair of the Department of Radiology, medical director for artificial intelligence for the Steele Institute for Health Innovation and Geisinger, medical director for 3D imaging and printing laboratory for Geisinger as well. He leads the informatic efforts in radiology at Geisinger, and he has over 100 publications and has given several invited lectures at regional, national, and international conferences. He has been at Geisinger in various capacities, For nearly 10 years, Dr. Patel is an electrical engineer and clinically an interventional radiologist. He is boarded in diagnostic radiology, interventional radiology, and clinical informatics, and is a fellow of the Society of Interventional Radiology. So thank you, Dr. Patel, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So the first person to present is Dr. Patel. So I just enabled the slide sharing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to share my slides here. Can you all see my slides?
Yep.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you all for the invitation. Appreciate the organizers for inviting me, and I'm honored and humbled by the opportunity. So today we're going to talk about AI in healthcare and the ethical issues raised during this journey to equity and zero harm. It's a large topic, so I have only a handful of minutes to talk about this. So I'm going to see if I can do it justice. I have no financial disclosures. We'll talk a little bit about the AI overview, talk about bias and fairness and their link, and then talk about patient safety, but with a slightly different point of view. What exactly is AI? AI refers to artificial intelligence, of course, it is a quest to build systems that can sense, think, act, and adapt like humans. Let me minimize this here. Machine learning, on the other hand, is using statistical and mathematical methods to enable machines to improve with experience, and these algorithms use improve their performance as they're exposed to more data. And deep learning is trying to replicate the architecture of the brain using multi-layered neural networks. Traditionally, when we speak of programming, you have data and you have instructions or algorithm that are going to operate on the data to produce an output. And machine learning, on the other hand, you have data and you have output, especially for the supervised learning side. You take the data, the output, and then figure out what the structure of the data is, or what the algorithm, the inherent algorithm that is part of it that produces that output from those data. Now that we talked about, generalized about what AI is, let's talk a little bit about AI ethics. There are different avenues to looking at this. World Economic Forum in 2016 published these 9 different ethical issues in AI. There are many more, ranging from unemployment to security to singularity. So we won't talk about necessarily all these issues, but we'll touch upon some of them. Another way of looking at it is looking at it as AI, ethical AI principles. When we make AI, what are the things that we should be considering in order to make sure that the AI ethics principles are followed? And as a part of that, I have selected safety and fairness, and which is then tied to bias, as are the things that we're going to discuss at this particular presentation. Bias is a difficult thing to define, believe it or not. It's described as systemic and repeatable errors in a computer system that create unfair outcomes, such as privileging one arbitrary group of users over others. Another way of looking at it is bias can be thought of as a mathematically defined concept, and fairness can be thought of as a socially defined concept. Bias can lead to fairness or unfairness, and that's one of the ways of looking at it. The output statistics from AI model are not always representative of reality. That's another way of looking at bias. Other different categories of bias. Bias can be introduced from data, from the model itself, or from the user interaction or user review of the output of the model. Let's take it one by one. Bias in data. We've all heard this, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And that still holds for AI as well. We have bias in, bias out. So let's say you have any data that is currently existing that is human generated is biased by definition. All those data have many different kind of biases, which we'll go through in a minute. But you take those biases and they say, I'm going to apply this great AI or machine learning model to it, and very accurate model is going to replicate what humans do using that data. And then you produce this great model, and have machine replicate the same biases you had in the data. So that's probably not the best way of doing things. Let's talk a little bit about the different types of data biases. There's historical bias. The state of the world we live in is not perfect, and the data generated within it are flawed. So there are existing biases in the world that are literally encoded into the data, whether they're unintended or intended due to prejudices. And even when you sample that data, even under perfect environment, it is still biased. And the group that are most affected by these data are those that are historically disadvantaged and excluded, are the most affected by these biases in the data, and therefore potentially lead to same biases when the machine does it. There is also representation bias. This occurs when training data is not a representative of the population which the model will serve. So if the data used to train, so we all heard this particular example where you've had data that have used facial recognition AI to create those algorithms, and they're mostly based on light-skinned faces, but then they have trouble recognizing and detecting darker skinned faces, and that makes sense, right? You're training data on one set, and then you're expecting a different outcome in a general population. How you collect data is also important. If you were to use smartphones, for example, to collect data, you will underrepresent those who have lower income or who have older demographics. And that will lead to incomplete, faulty, or prejudicial data sets, and therefore the AI that is trained using those data sets. We all have privacy concerns, and one of the movements in creating these data sets is a lot of the patients or a lot of the people whose data we're using to create AI want to opt out, and that's perfectly normal, and we should support that. On the other hand, it has unintended consequences. It can create potentially representation bias, where because if those people opt out, it doesn't now represent the population which is intended to serve. And therefore represents a representation bias. There's measurement bias. When we choose collect, or compute features or labels, when you use a noisy proxy for complex constructs, it can cause problems. So I'll give you an example. So sick people use a lot of healthcare, and therefore there are a lot of costs. So cost seems like a reasonable proxy for healthcare needs. So if you were to create a model that says, we're going to predict who has higher healthcare so we can resource things properly, it is possible that you will create a model that will say that those who are sickest will have higher healthcare needs. But it's also possible that those who are historically disadvantaged will get the brunt of it because they don't have access to healthcare, and therefore the costs are lower, and erroneously concluding that because their costs are lower, their healthcare needs are lower. So I think you have to choose the proxy. At a first glance, that proxy seems reasonable because it works in sick people, but it doesn't work in all people. So we have to be careful so that we don't propagate inequity. Let's talk about additional bias examples. We did this, what I think is a great model creation. We took about nearly 47,000 CT of the head, processed the data, trained the model. I'm not going to bore you with the technical details of it, but we trained the model to say whether there's bleeding in the head or not, and it worked. We can now take data from a CT scanner. It goes to the machine. The machine says yeah or nay. There is bleeding, and if there's bleeding, we reprioritize a list so it gets looked at by a human radiologist earlier so that we expedite patient care. Well, it's all great. We were able to do this and reduce our turnaround time for outpatient positive bleeds by 96%. It works. The problem was during the development process, early on, we noticed that if the data came from one hospital, then the probability of bleed was always 1. Whether there was bleed or not, there was always 1. And it was because of representation bias. We had unknowingly sampled all the positive cases from the hospital. So instead of latching on to the bleed, it actually latched onto the headgear that the patient is in. So those are the kind of things that you have to be careful about and continually think about what are the potential biases at every step of the way. Similarly, there was a great idea that let's use linguistic features to identify those who have Alzheimer's disease. So this company in Toronto took a lot of speech data from people in Ontario who are native English speakers, and used that data to train. But when they tested it and when they applied to not only the native English speakers but also French Canadians, whose native tongue was not English but it was French. So in that case, there was bias, and therefore it made it look like more French Canadians had Alzheimer's than they actually did. So again, the training data did not represent the model it was going to be used on, and therefore creating issues. So can we also be biased in the model? When you evaluate there's evaluation bias. It occurs when evaluating a model, and you use benchmark data that does not represent the population the model will serve. So models optimized using the training data, but the benchmarks are supposed to represent the whole population, which does not, and that leads to bias. Another kind of bias is the aggregation bias. So you have distinct populations, and they're inappropriately combined. We have, let's say there's a population of interest that is heterogeneous. A single model is unlikely to meet the needs of all of these people. So I'll give you a healthcare example. Hispanics have a higher rate of diabetes and diabetes-related complications than non-Hispanic whites. In those cases, if you were to create a model that is for every ethnicity, it may not work because some of these needs of a particular group, it has to be sensitive to those ethnic differences. Otherwise, the models will fail and may lead to the wrong conclusions. Same thing happens in South Asians. The diabetes in South Asians is different than other ethnicities. So we have to consider that may mean that you may need separate models for different ethnic groups, so that the performance is better and the conclusions are appropriate. There's also bias in human review, or when the humans use it. So a reviewer can introduce their own biases and decide whether to accept or disregard the model's prediction. That's certainly their right. But if they override the correct prediction because there are inherent prejudices, those are the things that are at risk. Bias happens throughout the chain. This is one way of looking at it. Bias happens from the data in the world. It's due to historical bias, representation bias, or other different biases. It can happen within the model itself during the creation, and it can happen in human review due to whether it's presentation bias or behavior bias, and then actions that lead. So when you have the entire bias chain, it can potentially cause harm to patients or to populations which it serves. Another way of looking at it is this: to collect data, label data, train, and to create these models. You have points, opportunities for human biases throughout. So that has to be considered at every single point. And what gets worse is that if you use a true machine learning, that means that you use the existing data to teach the model, and then you iterate on it and say, okay, now new data has come in. So if things are different, I'm going to teach the model again and to make it better. Well, you can potentially unknowingly make that worse. The inequities we were talking about because of these biases, you can make them worse because now you have biased data that is guiding more bias, and then it just creates a feedback loop that is potentially harmful. I'll talk a little bit about fairness. Fairness can be defined as absence of any prejudice or favoritism towards an individual or a group based on their inherent or acquired characteristics. A mouthful. Simplified, let's reiterate in many people's eyes, fairness is social concepts. It means that it's equalized odds, equal opportunity, demographic parity, or treatment equality. So all of those things combined can give us an idea what fairness is. Look, an example. Let's say a model predicts when an appointment no-show risk and accurately predicts it. You also learn that this high-risk population is overrepresented by those of lower economic means. You can take one of two actions. You can say, I'm going to overschedule this like airline industry does, and that way I can fill all those slots. That makes sense. So you increase access to patients, but it also perpetuates the inequity. It's maybe good for revenue, but not necessarily for the patient who needs that care. So a better approach may be to reach out to those individuals, work with them to understand what their issues are, what is preventing them from coming in, and perhaps in our region, it's patients don't have gas money to come to the healthcare institutions. So perhaps work with them to get their transportation, but they may not be able to take days off. All of those things are the reasons people don't show up. They don't necessarily not show up because that's what they do. It's because there are reasons for it. And if we work with them to remove some of those barriers, then we can decrease the disparity and still take better care of patients. It's still good for revenue, albeit with a little more expense. So what you do with the biases, what you do with that information is just as important as recognizing that there is that there is the bias. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about safety and the other side of the coin. So we always talk about safety in context of AI when it comes to are the algorithms accurate? Are the algorithms causing any harm, and so on? And those are important topics. And so that on FOSS point of view is well discussed elsewhere. But one thing I'm going to bring in is an orthogonal point of view, and that talks about patient safety in a different light. We'll first talk about what is patient safety. World Healthcare Organization defines patient safety as the absence of preventable harm to a patient during the process of healthcare, and the reduction of risk of unnecessary harm associated with with healthcare to an acceptable minimum. And they also recognize that every healthcare process, every care process has a degree of inherent unsafety. When you look at error burden worldwide, especially in low and middle income countries, 4 out of 10 patients are harmed in primary and ambulatory care settings. 134 million, these are annual numbers, 134 million adverse events occur in hospitals in low and middle income in countries, contributing to 2.6 million deaths. And medication errors cause and cost about $42 billion per year. So you would say that these are low and middle income countries. It doesn't really happen in the US, right? Of course, all of us are familiar with the 1999 Institute of Medicine report that says up to 98,000 deaths happen due to medical errors in the US. And at that time, it generated a lot of controversy. And this paper that came out in British Medical Journal from Hopkins generated additional controversy because they revised that number to 251,000 deaths per year. It is the 3rd largest cause of death in the US. Let that sink in a little bit. It is the 3rd largest cause of death in the US. What's going on? Are we all just bad healthcare providers? No, there are many factors at play, and let's talk about some of our processes and some of them are data related. So I'm going to just touch upon it. We don't have the time to go into depth, but I'll touch upon it. There is data overload. If I'll give you a radiology example. One radiologist in a radiology practice can look at 50 MRI studies a day. If on the average that has about 425 images per study, so that means that the radiologist is looking at one image every 1.5 seconds. One image every 1.5 seconds. We're reaching the limits of human capacity. Then on top of that, you have data overload. What does one mean by that? Well, you have, this is the example, I have a cardiogram. We do tens of different measurements on those data. But we as humans can process 3 to 7 variables at any given time and put in the context of the knowledge we have. If that's the case, then when you have tens of measurements, there's no way that we can do that effectively. And therefore, it leads to data waste. We have the data, we just don't know how to put it in the context when it comes to tens of variables. an example out of the UK. We have the amount of data that is presented to a doctor, in this case a radiologist, has increased over the years, but the number of radiologists has not increased. What that has led to is the decrease in interpretation time about 50%, and that has led to 16.6% more error because of that. So when you ask people to go beyond what they can physically do, errors tend to increase. Now, layer on top of that workforce shortages in the US and the world. So this is a 2017 article that predicted that we were going to have 150,000 nurse shortages by 2020 and 500,000 by 2030. Well, 2020 came, we still have the shortages, but on top of that, we're now affected by the Great Resignation and the turmoil in healthcare that has happened. So that problem has only gotten worse and will continue to get worse over time. Are we alone? No, we're not. We have in China, there's a shortage of doctors. In Europe, there is 2 million healthcare workers, short of 2 million healthcare workers. In India, 500,000 healthcare worker shortage. And in the US, we're predicted to have by Association of American Medical Colleges that by 2032, we'll have 122,000 physician shortage. How are we going to take care of people? When it comes to AI, it's not about replacing humans. It is something that we're going to need in order to help improve care, improve efficiency and the cost of care. But really, it's about machine and humans working together to provide better care. We don't have a choice. Here's one potential example of how you can improve, reduce errors and improve efficiency. So this is an example of a system. This is an article out of Google, but there are commercial programs and algorithms out there, which if you use in conjunction with the radiologist, that as a second reader, it improves or reduces false positives by 5.2% and false negative by 9.4%. So in that kind of a scenario, not only are you improving the time to read, but you're also doing a better job and decreasing unnecessary care for patients, as well as providing care to those who actually need it. In this setting of higher error rates, related deaths, and healthcare labor shortages, which is now exacerbated, is not using AI an option? Personally, I don't think so. In summary, when generating AI models, we must recognize that biases and related fairness issues are a reality, and the fairness and bias should be considered during every phase of the model development, testing, and deployment, and post-deployment as well, because the effects of the model should be monitored and course corrected as needed. We need to continue to educate the public and the researchers and move to the next phase to find solutions. Because, at least in my view, AI is not an optional thing in medicine. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. So I guess now we switch to Dr. Marchand, please.
Great. So hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes.
And so that was a great lead in, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those same issues that Dr. Patel did, but I'll be able to skip over some because he went in such good depth on it. So I'm a firm believer also in AI in healthcare is really essential. I think, there's a lot of applications in just administration, things like billing and patient contact and, record keeping and so on. That's incredibly useful. I think it will produce better patient outcomes. Hopefully it will reduce healthcare costs. We keep on hearing about healthcare technologies reducing costs, and they always seem to increase costs. But I do believe there is a real potential for AI to reduce healthcare costs, which is really important, and to save many patients' lives. And in fact, I can say my life is probably saved by AI. I had an incident a couple of years ago that I completely out of the blue, I had no idea was coming. And my emergency room physician said that my AI and my smartwatch probably saved my life. I almost certainly would have had a fatal stroke that night if I hadn't come in, which was flagged by my phone, so by my watch. So I already am, I think, a testament that this technology is already saving lives today and will save even more going forward. But there are all these issues, and Dr. Patel talked about bias, there's explainability, data privacy, liability, there's all kinds of other ones that we don't have time to get into, training and so on. But let me just go through these four quite quickly. And I'll be very brief on bias because Dr. Patel did just a terrific job going into a lot of depth on the different types of bias. I like this book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, which was one of the very first publications that really call attention to this potential for bias of the garbage in, garbage out problem, that if the data is biased, and our society has historically been so biased that so much of the data out there has that bias baked into it, that if we just use the algorithm with that bias without trying to correct for it, we're going to get garbage out or bias out. And it looks objective, but it really isn't. And we're seeing this in the healthcare area. This is an article from Science and Scientific American of a major algorithm used in a lot of healthcare. Over 100 million patients are using this healthcare risk prediction algorithm. And it turned out it's systematically biased against African Americans because it says that the fact that they use less healthcare because of the bias built into both our economic and our healthcare system results in them using less healthcare. That means they need less healthcare. So it's reinforcing the bias that's already in our society and carrying it forward, and perhaps even more extremely, because if we don't account for that or take account of that built-in bias. And then, as Dr. Patel is saying, when the data changes, so there's a great example of this AI system that helps to alert of sepsis. I think it developed at Johns Hopkins initially, but very promising AI technology. But the University of Michigan, when they're using it, started to get all these spurious warnings. And when they sort of investigated, they had to deactivate it, was because of the COVID pandemic, there's a very different profile of patients coming into their hospital, and the machine was not calibrated for those patients' data, and therefore was giving all these wrong decisions. So this is, again, going to be a persistent problem with these AI systems, that the data has to be both representative of the population we're looking at, and it has to be corrected for any bias built into it. A second major problem with AI is the transparency and the lack of explainability. This is a MIT technology review article talking about the problem with machine learning is it's incorporating these huge data streams that are beyond our mind to fathom, and it's coming out with some output. We cannot understand how it gets to where it gets to. We can't replicate it in our own minds. We can't be a quality check on it with our own minds. And so what is a doctor, for example, supposed to do if the AI system recommends a procedure or a way forward that may be inconsistent with what he initially or she initially thought would be the way forward? Do you trust this machine when you can't understand how it came to its decision? The AI systems aren't able to explain how they decide what they do. And this is a problem because healthcare systems, our AI systems are in some ways incredibly stupid. They have no common sense. They're amazing at what they can do with data processing, of being able to process these huge amounts of data, but they lack our human common sense. And this is an example of a hospital that was dealing with the problem of they had too many patients with pneumonia to admit them all. And so they're trying to figure out which patient should we admit and which should we send home. And they asked their AI system to look at that. And the AI system came back and said, you know, any patient who comes in with pneumonia and asthma, send home. And the reason it turned out it was doing that is because that hospital, asthma patients with pneumonia are immediately put in acute care, get the very top end treatment, and therefore have pretty good outcomes. But the machine didn't understand that common sense things that the doctors immediately did, and understood that this is a bad recommendation because it was just looking at the input and the output and says, hey, if you have asthma with pneumonia, you have a better result. Not understanding that they were getting better treatment. Obviously that can be fixed, but the machine didn't recognize it on its own. And this is going to be the problem with healthcare AI. After the technology review article, a few months later, they had another article saying deep learning is a black box, but healthcare won't mind, saying that, even though we don't understand how these machines are doing what they're doing, they are coming up with these incredibly useful and life-saving, recommendations. And even if we don't understand, if we save lives, that's great. And so that's the difficult ethical issue is, how much should we trust these machines when we can't understand them? And, we don't want to just disregard them because they could be saving a lot of lives because they are able to look at all this data. A third major issue is data privacy. And so we're already seeing problems with this. This is an example in England where DeepMind, Google was given access to all these healthcare records from hospitals to look for this sort of recent outbreak of a particular kidney problem that was going on in these hospitals. And the machine helped with that, but it turned out it also looked at a lot of other healthcare data in those records that it had not gotten express permission to do. And actually, there's a lawsuit going on right now about this as a violation of healthcare privacy in the UK. We've had a number of issues in the US. Here, Google and Mayo Clinic have created an agreement to share all the healthcare data from the Mayo Clinic to Google. And that is actually legal under HIPAA, under the administrative exception to HIPAA. And so these patients have not consented to this. They're not aware of this, but when they're told about it, they get very uneasy. And so how, if at all, do we need to change our health privacy laws to address these? There is a recent example, again, in the University of Chicago, agreed to share all healthcare data with Google again. And what was interesting here is that data was anonymized. So here, it wasn't the administrative exception under HIPAA, but it was anonymized data, which is often a way we are able to use healthcare data in the research world, which is really important, obviously. But the interesting article raised in this lawsuit was that there is no such thing as anonymized data with Google, because they have Google Search, they have Google Maps, they have Fitbits now, they have all these different technologies that's gathering data. And the argument put forward in this lawsuit was that Google can figure out who these people are in these anonymized health records. It didn't get to the merits of the case. It was dismissed on a standing issue, which is the case for a lot of these privacy lawsuits right now. But this is raising, I think, this profound issue of, can we continue to rely on anonymized data in research if we have AI that can possibly re-identify people? And this is going to be, again, a big challenge going forward. And then finally, I want to talk about just liability. There's been a number of historical research projects on medical liability, medical malpractice liability, going back over 100 years. And the consistent conclusion of these studies, like this one by William Sage, one of the real leading researchers on the medical liability, was that new technology is the #1 driver of medical liability. It sort of seems counterintuitive. This is a better technology. Why is it that it's causing liability? And it's because the more you can do, the more you can do wrong. For example, before we had kidney dialysis machines, if kidneys were non-functional, you just died. And but there's no liability to doctors. There's nothing doctors could do. We then got the kidney dialysis machines, and many patients' lives could be saved. But we also saw a huge uptick in liability cases against doctors for not using that technology, for not using it correctly, for patients who had unreasonable expectations about what the technology could do. So for a number of reasons, when we get these new technologies, we see this big kick up in the amount of litigation. We're seeing that in genetics right now, and we're now probably going to see this in AI. And so that's going to, create a red flag for healthcare professionals, providers. What is going to be their liability risk with this new technology? And I sort of see 3 really fundamental challenges here. One is the learning curve. At some point, each of these AI technologies, and again, there's going to be hundreds of them in our healthcare system, so each will be different, but at some point they won't be as good as a human performance. But then at some point they may surpass human performance and actually be much better and save a lot of lives. But the problem is we may need to spend time on this part of the curve and give it the real life experience in order for it to get better, because it learns by experience, it learns from data. And so how do we manage that as an ethical matter and as a legal matter? The very same issue is going on with autonomous cars and AI. So again, you can simulate these cars on simulation tracks a lot, but at some point you need the real world experience to be out there in the real world and encountering these real life situations. The great thing about AI is when they have a thing go wrong, they learn from it, and the whole fleet or the whole technology can all be trained to avoid that in the future. Unlike humans, where you'd have to do it for each individual humans, you can do it across the board with it for AI systems. So they'll learn much faster, but there will be these incidents until it gets better than a human, where it makes mistakes, and in the healthcare context, maybe lives are at stake. How do we deal with that? Liability obviously will be one way to deal with that, but if the liability is too heavy-handed, it's going to put that technology out of business or deter new entrants from coming into that field. On the other hand, we don't want to just make some patients guinea pigs and who are subjected to this technology and then are harmed or even lose their lives because the machine needs to learn. So how we manage this learning curve phenomenon, I think, is going to be a huge challenge. The second issue is tipping point. At some point, early on, each of these technologies, and each again will be a different dynamic and different timing, using an algorithm in healthcare will be and relying on it will be medical malpractice. It isn't validated, it isn't proven, and it's going to make mistakes. And so for a doctor to rely on that algorithm would be medical malpractice. But at some point, it will get better than the human, and then to not rely on it will be malpractice. So one day it's malpractice to rely on it, and then at some subsequent day it'll be malpractice not to rely on it. How is a doctor supposed to know where that tipping point is, given that the tipping point will be different for every algorithm, and maybe in every context it'll be different? And so the doctor is put in this very difficult position of, how do I know when I can and should rely on this algorithm as opposed to not? And that's going to be a huge problem. There's no database or government website you can go to and look this up to tell you as a doctor whether or not you can rely on this algorithm. And then third, what's really interesting is sort of this issue of standard of care. What standard of care should apply to an AI system? So historically in liability, we have product liability applying to equipment, devices, technologies, and to the manufacturer of that. And then we have professional liability to the doctor, who's a human making this decision. And we have very different standards. For the medical malpractice to the doctor, we have a negligence-based standard, usually without punitive damages, usually without class actions. With the product liability against equipment, we have strict liability, which is a more stringent liability standard. We have punitive damages, we have class actions, and so on. Which should apply to an AI system? You would think automatically it should be to the product liability, but if the AI system for the first time is actually making decisions, we've always had technology helping doctors make decisions, but it's always been the doctor. But if the machine is now essentially making the decision, all the doctor can do is really rubber stamp it, because he or she can't really fully second guess the machine. Should we move to more of a medical malpractice standard for AI systems? And so there's been some interesting discussion in the legal literature of how do we determine the standard of care for AI systems, and that's going to have huge repercussions for how big of a problem or issue liability is. So I'll just close with this cartoon. The AI system said, "I'm being sued for a misdiagnosis. What I do now?" And the doctor leaning back says, "Sorry, buddy, comes with the job." And then I'll just conclude with this great quote I love. We tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. I think that's the case for AI in healthcare. There's a lot of expectations and thoughts put into this, that this is going to change things overnight. And it's not going to be that fast. It is coming into the healthcare world, but it's going to come gradually and sort of step by step. But in the long run, this really will be a fundamental change in our healthcare system, and hopefully, and I believe, much for the better. So let me end there, and we're happy to look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patel and Dr. Marchand, for both incredible presentations, and the different angles have been very, very enriching. I will start with one question, and probably is the last one that we have. So I'll start from the bottom up. With both of your perspectives in the active implementation and from the legal side, when do you think we will reach the limits of AI, of the implementation of AI or the use of AI in healthcare, both not only in time, but in terms of functionality, in terms of where are the limits? What are the borders that AI will never be able to cross, in your opinion?
So I can talk a little bit about that and provide my perspective. So I don't think there is a limit in the future to what AI can do. Mm-hmm. And the reason is I speak as an engineer, and a lot of things have surprised me over the years. So when I first started, I was a medical student, and one of my mentors said, "Hey, there's this something called neural network. Can you go figure it out?" So it was an engineer from IBM, that was me, and a friend of mine, an engineer from AT&T. We met in college, and we said, okay, we're going to work on this, and we worked on it over the summer. We ran into some issues. We didn't have digital data, so I was physically taking video cassettes and digitizing data, using a sound card, a Doppler signature, writing code to compress that to feed to the network. So we had a problem that we didn't have volumes of digital data. Forget about a variety of digital data. Second was compute. It took my desktop 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to teach a handful of cases to the network, and it worked, but it was not enough. We didn't have access to enough compute, and at that time, frankly, this is back in early 90s, there was not enough compute to do what we actually needed to do. Things have changed since, and a lot of the things that are possible today are because we have more data and because we have more compute. And we have better algorithms. So am I hopeful? The answer is yes. Do I see any barriers? The answer is no. I don't think there are a whole lot of barriers to the engineering when it comes to that. Right now there are, but in the future, I have hopes. Are we anywhere near general purpose AI? We're not. We're far from it, and we're probably decades from it if you listen to some of the experts in it. But are we doing a much better job now than we did 20, 30 years ago? Absolutely. So with that, if you were to extrapolate that, I don't think there's a limit. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I agree with what Dr. Patel said, but I think it's very, very hard to predict more than a couple of years ahead in technology, of any type of technology. And so, there's all these predictions about artificial general intelligence of when and what it will do. And those are just extremely difficult to really get a firm grasp on and really understand where this technology is going. I mean, very few people could predict the technology we have now 10 years ago, and it's going to be even more difficult 10 years ahead. What we do know is that the AI systems are better at certain things now than they are, but they may get better at other things in the future. So for now, obviously, things like computation, be able to look at large sets of data and make sense of that and identify patterns and diagnoses and treatments from that data. That's where its strength is, as well as some of the administrative functions. It's not good at things like counseling a patient or understanding a patient and empathy. Dr. Eric Topol wrote a very good book I highly recommend called Deep Medicine, about how AI is going to change the role of the doctor, because many of these sort of technical steps of diagnosing what's going on in the patient's body will be able to be done by AI, but the AI is not going to be good, at least for the next couple decades, probably, at understanding the psychology of the patient, of explaining the results to the patient, of having empathy with the patient. And so more and more of the doctor's role will be that latter set of skills, which unfortunately has sort of been underemphasized, I think, lately in medical education. It's more, on the technical diagnosis sides, that is a part that will be replaced first by AI. So I don't think there are necessarily any limits, but I think that there's in different time scales, there'll be things where the AI is better at and less good at.
Thank you so much. The audience is also asking, can AI become selfish and turn against us?
So I got involved in AI because I got a grant. I was a co-PI on a grant from the Future of Life Foundation that Elon Musk funded $10 million to look at artificial general intelligence. And we got 25 of the top AI people in the country together from academia, from Google DeepMind, Facebook, IBM, the military, and so on, to talk about the risks of artificial general intelligence and the fact that it may at some point decide to exterminate us. And there is tremendous disagreement among these experts. I mean, there was no consensus either on when it will happen or even if it will happen. There were some who thought it may never happen. Others thought it could happen as soon as 20, 25 years from now. Others thought 60, 80 years. But, you know, there is work being done now to create emotions in AI, with the reason being is that for the AI to truly understand humans and be able to respond well with humans and really, you know, help us more, it has to understand those human emotions. And therefore it has to be trained to have those. So there's actually active efforts underway now to give emotions to AI. Right now, they don't have any emotions. They don't care one way or the other. And that way, you know, that's why, you know, I'm sort of hopeful we can deal with issues like bias, because unlike humans who seem to have this inclination to be biased, it's in part of our nature, it seems, these machines don't have that built in. They don't have any stake in being biased. And so maybe they can be trained not to be. Much easier than perhaps humans can be. So, you know, right now they don't have those emotions, but there is a lot of work going on in that area. And it's probably likely at some point in the future, whether it's 20 years or 50 years from now, they will have these emotions. And then the big question is, at some point, will they see us as sort of a nuisance, something that will block their stated objectives and, you know, wipe us out? And so, you know, the book Superintelligence sort of talks about this by Nick Bostrom of this long-term risk, and how real it is, I'm not sure.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I
If I
concur
may
with
interrupt for a second, wouldn't be giving emotions to the AI a little bit counterproductive? Because emotion by themselves introduce the bias in our quote-unquote logical thinking. So a part of making the interface, you know, more livable for the humans, wouldn't the emotion literally counter? It's like a counterproductive, or, you know, totally counter the idea behind the AI.
So in my view, that question can only be answered depending on what the use case is, right? So if the use case is like Professor Marchand was talking about, is about interacting with humans and providing them emotional support, then without those emotions, it's difficult to provide the emotional support, right? So let's say right now we don't have AI can't provide emotional support, but let's say in the future there are androids that have intelligence that can provide to do that. Without that emotion, it's going to be difficult for them to do that. And I think so. So it's going to be depend on the use case. There are going to be use cases that doesn't require that. But when we talk about general purpose AI, it's going to be difficult not to do that, because it's everything we're trying to do. So in some cases, perhaps it may be that you need to turn the emotion off. Maybe that's what's part of the issue and part of the design. But I think in some use cases, emotions are required.
Yeah, just to give a specific example, I once heard a great talk that someone gave the example of the Microsoft paperclip. Do you remember, you know, 10 years ago or so on, when you're using Windows, there's this Microsoft paperclip that popped up, sort of a primitive AI, and it just annoyed the heck out of people. It was incredibly unsuccessful because it had no sense of how you're responding to it and how it's interacting with you. And therefore it was incredibly ineffective as a guide to try to help you. And so, you know, when we deal with, like, we're going to all these chat bots, for example, to interact with patients who call in. And if those are going to be effective, they're going to have some degree of emotion and some degree of empathy to understand what that patient is experiencing. Why are they frustrated? Why are they angry? Why are they sad? And if the machine is just this objective, you know, cool as ever, just, you know, mechanical interaction, it's going to be very ineffective in dealing with humans. And as we have more and more interactions of AI and humans, it's going to have some kind of emotion or understanding of emotion, at least, to be able to interact with us in an effective way.
Yes, also to that point, when you start adding like the different layers of cultural sensitivity or appropriateness or origin or language and nuances and localizations of languages, it seems like that the possibility of that emphasization with patients is a little bit remote or too far away. How do you see that in reality? In terms of real implementations.
So you're asking how do you be receptive to different types of human thinking? Is that what you're sort of getting at?
Yes, when you're thinking about the possibility of being empathetic with a patient and having emotions, having emotions. There's not one definition of how do you have emotions. It's also like there are different lenses and variables that go on top of that. And it can go anywhere from, the country of origin to the cultural awareness to socioeconomic levels to languages and to nuances and localities in every single place. So the personalization that needs to happen within that same, providing emotions to AI seems a very difficult job. So how do you see this, and how do you see the evolution?
It's definitely a huge challenge for sure. This is by no means an easy issue, and this won't happen overnight. This will take years to really get done well. But I think one of the really interesting things about AI development is it's really made us recognize and really be impressed really with the human mind and our capabilities of how much we are actually able to do of all these different tasks of moving from one to the other. So one of the things will be, who are the great human counselors? Who are the doctors and the other healthcare providers who are able to provide comfort to the broad range of patients they see? Because there are some humans who have gotten very good at that. So we can learn from them, and the machines can learn from them and see these humans who have these great capabilities and try to replicate those to the extent they can. And the great thing about AI is it can gather data from all kinds of people. It has this capacity to look at 1 million people and understand their counseling, both their abilities and their styles and their successes, and to integrate that and to understand then how to interact with various types of people and to identify the factors that might make a person more or less receptive to a certain approach. So there's a lot of potential there to actually learn from humans who are really have these amazing brains that maybe someday will be surpassed by AI, but not for a long time, I don't think.
I agree, and I'll add a couple of things to this. I think if I were to sum up your question, how do you instill cultural competency into AI? So I think one of the things I mentioned in the talk that I gave was talk about generalization, right? So if you're not recognizing that there are differences in the way we do things and the way we interpret things and what the differences are, we have to recognize those and either train the model to recognize those differences and respond to them, and based on the data that Dr. Marchant was talking about, or we have to create different models for them so that we are recognizing those differences and making sure that those needs of that population are satisfied. So I think that recognition is the key, and getting the data appropriate for that is going to be the other key.
In fact, one area where this is having some success is in education. So there's all these AI educational systems being developed to help like students during the summer, for example, when they're out of school. And one of the great strengths of those systems is they are being able to recognize different learning patterns, that different students learn in very different ways. And these AI systems are being able to be trained to identify those patterns by how the student is responding and really customize their education. And so we're going to have personalized education, just like we have personalized medicine, because so many people learn in different ways and have different strengths and weaknesses and things that they respond to and don't respond well to. And these AI systems may be able to detect that and respond in a real-time way to that. So there can be some strengths of these systems in terms of these interactions.
So it's a very.
I think this is a very.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrea.
No, go ahead, please.
I think this is a very good example what you just said about how positivity of using the AI, because one of the problems is that we always look at quite often we look at the AI as a competition, like in the medical field. If you give that talk to my colleagues, they will be very worried about their job because they will ask you, what is our value proposition? But then if you're talking about, okay, we can use that to enhance the education, make us better. I think it's a little bit changed the perspective on how AI is being perceived, because from both of your presentation, obviously there's no way radiologists can see more, examine more, right? And there's AI who can do it much more effectively. So the question is like, what do I do? Then there is me who I'm the critical care doctor. Okay, and at some point I have to make a decision in a very, very complex environment. If there's AI who makes a decision for me, why would I sort of not surrender that? Especially that at some point we believe that the AI will be a better diagnostic tool. So there's a lot of like perception that this is dangerous. And maybe, what you said is a little bit like, oh, they're actually positive that we can make ourselves better with the AI or using the AI. So I find it actually quite interesting take.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the effect of AI on employment is sort of a mixed bag. I mean, in some ways, it's going to make a lot of people be able to do their jobs better and maybe even be able to focus on things that are better, more interesting and so on. But on the other hand, it will displace some workers. And so, for example, I'm a lawyer. A lot of the things that first and second year lawyers do is now being displaced by AI systems that are doing the legal research and the document review much more accurately and much more less expensively, and it's displacing the human workers. There's concerns about truck drivers being displaced by autonomous cars. And in the healthcare context, there's, some fields like Dr. Patel, the radiology and pathology people talk about, some of those jobs being displaced. I don't think it would ever displace all radiologists or all pathologists, but I'd like to ask Dr. Patel, I mean, do you see this as a potential deterrent if you're have a medical student who's just finished their medical degree and is looking for their residency? Should they be thinking twice about radiology or pathology because those are particular specialties that AI may displace, a significant amount of the doctors in?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, Professor Marchant. I think so. A couple of giants of AI 5 years ago predicted that we should stop training radiologists because in 5 years they'll be obsolete.
Right.
This month is the 5th year anniversary of that statement, and we have not replaced radiologists yet. Right. So to your point earlier, that it's very difficult to predict the future. But the complexity of medicine is also something that, as wonderful as AI is, and I'm a proponent, the complexity of medicine is a barrier. So can we replace can replace humans? Yeah, initially it may be that there are certain tasks repetitive tasks that you replace them with, and there are going to be things that you can do that, but that allows the humans to actually focus on things that the AI can't do and do it better. So I think it's something I have a much more positive outlook on that. Right now, I'm more worried about taking care of patients because we don't have enough people, let alone worry about unemployment. And that's going to be a bigger challenge in healthcare than to worry about unemployment or be AI replacing people. First of all, I don't think it's a reality in the near term, but it may replace things that are repetitive, and it should. And I think we've been here before, right? During a century ago or 2 centuries ago, when industrial revolution was going on, we were talking about 80-hour work weeks. People were working more than 5 days, and they were literally being worked to death. Industrial revolution comes, and along, of course, with other changes in labor laws and so on, we have shorter work weeks. People are potentially happier than they were at that time. So I'm hoping for a 20-hour work week.
Or at least a 4-day.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting. I think
the point is that there are always negative to it, but I think we should capitalize on the positives of while
I
recognizing.
think, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the shortening of our work, because in medicine, you know, we work quite a lot and the shortage will get better. But, you know, the other interesting thing that we sort of touch is AI has to learn on the patients. And sort of example that comes to my mind is that that's a potential deterrent, because the process of learning will result with some potential harm to the patient. But the interesting thing is, like, we train the resident and fellow every year, right? So, and there is also a sort of problem related to that. Like, you have to supervise, you have to be on top. I don't see this dramatically different than teaching AI in some of the aspects. And, you know, this is unfortunately broadcast. That's why I may lose my job when I say what I'm going to say. But the AI, you just need to train once and then you're done, right? Sort of you reach certain equilibrium and you're done. Versus resident, you keep repeating this process over and over. So where is the really true risk in this? So maybe, and I will check if I have a job after this.
Well, I mean, the very same thing in autonomous cars, right? I mean, so people talk about the autonomous cars are not perfect, but I just had 2 teenagers become drivers, and I'd rather have that autonomous car driving me than my 2 teenagers. I mean, they're terrible at first, but they learn, you know, and so humans make a lot of mistakes and they get better over time. I've been told never to have surgery in July because that's when you have all the new residents. You know, I don't know how true that is, but, you know, all those people have to learn, and they sometimes learn through mistakes. And as you said, the difference with AI is you make the mistake once with the AI and you can, you know, learn that lesson across the whole system, then it will never do it again. Where every human has to learn on our own how to drive, how to be a good surgeon or a good doctor. And each of us makes our own mistakes as part of that learning process. So in some ways, there may be a lot less mistakes with the AI system. And someone says the July myth has been debunked in studies. That's good to hear.
Dr. Patel, any comments to, because you train the people, right, in radiology? So
yeah,
listen,
I think you know, training a machine is if you were to train a neural network, it's like training a baby, right? If you were to say neural network, I'm going to present you examples of dogs, and only give them Dalmatians, the network is going to think that all dogs have spots on it, unless you presented a variety of things, right? So it learns in phases. And if you were to do neural network training, you learn in epochs. You're presenting the data in small volumes, just like we presented the residents. So we are training the networks in a small quantities, and you know, I'm not going to go deep into the training sessions, but the point is we're presenting data. It gets better. Perhaps we change things and it gets better. So I think that iteration still happens in the AI models, albeit it may happen in a much shorter period of time, or maybe even a longer period of time. But it depends. So I don't know if I would say that when you train the AI, it's one and done. I think if you use the true learning part of it, the opportunity is to improve the AI based on the new data. But again, there's the risk that if you have biased data and actually you have that feedback loop, you can actually make things much worse. Recognition of that has to be there so that you don't fall into that. Does that make sense?
I think it makes to a certain degree, but I think, you know, the learning as a dangerous process is sort of distributed on both sort of sides of the equation, human and non-human. And I think that's one of the interesting set. You know, the other question that I had is, like, AI lives off the data, and we keep talking how much data are biased. Well, if all data sets are biased, how are we going to make actual AI that will somehow be able to correct for that, learn without that? Like, again, Amazon tried to create the AI which is supposed to hire the people based on the CV, and it didn't work because the people were hired before were predominantly white males. There was another AI who did this similar thing in the for assessing the risk of the skipping parole in the prisoners. Then there's plenty of examples why this doesn't work. So the question is there something that we can do it? Because we always might have this problem, garbage in and garbage out.
Right. So I think that's a very good point. So two things. One is institutions like the NIH are trying to generate data that are less biased, right? So there was a recent grant proposal, a grant application, where there were 3 different things, and one of them is to come up with mechanism and data structures so that the data we generate and so proactively generate data that are less biased. So that's one approach. And the second is that we have this existing data. Is there a way to actually look at it as an inverse problem and say, I have this data, this is the outcome that it has, but let's look at what the outcome we want it to be, and then backtrack and say, can we correct those data? You know, I haven't worked out the math, and one of these days I will, but I think if that can be solved, then absolutely we can take the current data and perhaps correct it to make sure that we are reducing the bias. I can't say eliminate the bias, because I don't think we'll ever be able to eliminate bias, because we are humans and we are biased by nature, but at least we can reduce those biases. Again, I don't know if the inverse problem issue is possible, but I hope it is. And once I dig into it more, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I mean, the Amazon example was very sobering, because even once they realized then that this was discriminating systematically against women, they couldn't correct it. They tried to correct it and they were unsuccessful. So they had to drop the whole thing. Very sophisticated company, obviously, and they knew there was a bias there and they couldn't figure out how to get around it. But, you know, there are other contexts where you can get around it. For example, facial recognition. So the initial facial recognition technology systems were basically trained almost exclusively on white males. And so not surprisingly, it should have been predictable. It's sort of astonishing people deployed these systems without thinking about this, but they would get females and people of darker skin wrong. And, we've had a number of people being arrested for crimes they did not commit based on a facial recognition, and they're systematically, African-American or people with dark skin. But NIST has been, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has been testing these systems and found some were just absolutely abysmal. But others have gotten much, much better. And it turns out if you take the effort to, get data sets that are basically include women and people of darker skin, the system will get trained on those and will get better. And some of the newer facial recognition technologies have gotten almost no bias whatsoever. So that's been an example where you can fix the data because you're generating the data yourself. Who are the people you're allowing the machine to look at? And so, it's harder when you have to use historical data, like in some medical contexts or criminal justice, because you can't, generate the new data very easily. Things like arrests record. That's just a fact. And the fact that that's bias is something you can't change. You can use synthetic data. There's a lot of effort going on now to create new synthetic data sets that are not biased in order to help train systems. And, there's a lot of work being done. People like IBM and other companies have created tools to look for bias in data sets. Bias audits, there's other entities are developing those to look for bias in your AI system. So there's a tremendous amount of effort going into this, and at least some of that will succeed. But, it can't change the fact that history shows that we are biased. And if we're using historical data, there's going to be biases built into that.
Fascinating. Yes, Dr. Patel, you wanted to.
I was going to say, just recognizing that bias does exist, and every single step in the model creation, you have to look for points of biases, and unless you do that, and I don't, having erred on this, and one of the examples I gave, you have to make sure that every point you thought about the biases and try to fix it so that the whole process is better. I gave an example of when we first started, we only focused on positive cases of one hospital. It was unknowingly, but we didn't ask ourselves the question that can this be a bias point, right? Data balancing is important. The representation of data from all hospitals were more important. And we didn't do that. And that was our error, but we learned from that error. And it's a clear example of what shouldn't be done.
Mm-hmm. I building on your comment, Dr. Patel, and your perspective, Dr. Marchand, I was very interested when you mentioned the switch in considering AI more of a medical malpractice, within the medical malpractice arena legally, as to product liability, no? So the fact that AI may be, as we move on and as doctors develop more, as AI develops more diagnostic capabilities and interacts more completely or more integrally in the healthcare systems, how they become, between quotes, doctors or medical professionals, and they're treated as such. So are there any, I was wondering, are there any cases going on or being disputed at those levels?
There hasn't been a lot of AI liability cases yet. You know, there's this fascinating case outside the medical context in Switzerland where an art gallery was created an AI bot and put it on the internet and with some Bitcoin and told to buy interesting things for their art gallery. And they started shipping all these things, you know, a mass from Madagascar and crazy things from all over the world that became very interesting. And people would come to the art gallery every week to see the new collections that were brought in. And then one day the police knocked on the door and said, here's a pound of ecstasy you've ordered. That's a criminal act. Here's a stolen Belgian passport. That's a criminal act. Who ordered these? And they said, it wasn't us. We didn't know this machine would do this. We didn't have the mens rea, the intent for it to be a crime for us. And so the police ended up taking the machine down to the police station for a few weeks. We don't know what they did with it, but they sort of they brought it back and said they're not making any charges. But here crimes were committed, but no one had the mental state to commit a crime. Neither the humans who let unleash a system and did not intend or even anticipate it would do these criminal acts, nor did the machine have obviously criminal intent. And so how we deal with this is going to be a real challenge, I think, to the legal system. But there'll be no question that, you know, the plaintiffs' lawyers will want to try to push this back into the product liability box, just because you get punitive damages and class actions and strict liability, all these things that result in much higher verdicts. And we're seeing this, for example, in the robotic surgery litigation, where you know, the lawyers are arguing that even though it may have been the doctor who messed up, rather than the machine manufacturer who made the mistake that caused the burning or the damage, they're going after the machine manufacturer under a theory, for example, that the machine manufacturer did not adequately train the doctor who used the machine. And so they're trying to get at the product liability and not the medical malpractice that has so many limits on it. You know, damages caps are in many states and other things that make medical malpractice actually a hard lawsuit to bring. And so I'm imagining and predicting we'll see the same thing in the AI context.
Agree. And there's a company called IDX. Now they've changed the name to Digital Diagnostics. One of their products is to diagnose diabetic retinopathy without any kind of human interface. So they have a camera. You take a picture. The camera will do quality checks on it. If it passes the quality checks, then it will determine with about 95% accuracy whether the patient has diabetes retinopathy or not, a diabetic retinopathy. The good thing about that is that it improves access. It can be put in a family practice doc's office without them having the expertise. The AI will help them understand who's at risk for that and prevent blindness. So there are good things to it, but the company also recognizes that there are liability issues here. So they've actually bought, you know, what I call medical malpractice insurance or liability insurance to protect them against that, right? Because they recognize that this opens them up to the same things that the physicians go through. So I think that's I agree with Professor Marchant that it's going to those kind of things are going to increase, and they should, right? So it's not a perfect system.
And the other tricky issue is, you know, what is the standard of care we're going to expect from a machine? So for doctors, you know, most states have what's called a custom. What is other doctors of a similar training do in your community in that situation? Would they have made the same decision, or was it within the realm of the decision they would have made? But how do you do that for a machine? So there's a very interesting example where there is an app out there that you take on your smartphone and look at a mole, and it would tell you whether it's likely to be melanoma or not. And the FTC ordered it off the market and said it wasn't good enough. The company's defense was that this is better than the average physician, the average better general physician. But the FTC said, no, it's got to be at the level of the top expert, the top dermatologist. So it's an interesting decision because I live in Arizona. There's a lot of sun. There have a lot of rural cities like Kingman or Prescott and others, Payson, where they don't have top dermatologists there. So the choice is either this app or your local doctor. And this app was better than the local doctor, but it wasn't good enough, said the FTC, so they took it off the market. So what is the standard that we're going to require these machines to make? Is it the average physician? Is it the very top physician? Is it somewhat, for autonomous cars, the expectation is they'll be better than a human driver by quite a bit in order to not be liable. So this will be a very interesting issue of how do we establish a standard of care for a machine? We know how to do it for humans, but not for a machine.
Yeah, I think AI has a PR problem. So we are holding AI to much higher standards than we ever hold humans.
Right.
And perhaps we should, because maybe that is the advantage. But the example that Professor Marchand was giving, then now we have access issue in rural areas, and there's a mole on a patient. The patient can't come in to see a doctor for a long period of time. Is an imperfect AI better than nothing at all?
Right.
So are we disadvantaging patients for not using AI? Is there another liability issue? I think this goes to your hill that you showed. So if you have a solution available and you choose not to use it, then because of whatever reason, right? Then are you liable? Right. And the answer eventually will be yes, because it becomes ubiquitous and you choose not to use it. It may be, I think the example you gave was for a healthcare professional, but it may be institutional liability as well, that you're not using the technologies that are available to you for whatever reason. And most of the time it's going to be finances, right? Not everybody can afford that. So.
Yeah, definitely.
And this also makes me think of the point that you're making of population health in the developing countries. So it's not only the rural access in the US, but when you think, I do a lot of work with Mexico and in some states, what you say, Dr. Patel, is right on point. If I can enhance a community health worker to go and have a better reach, and I'm including people in the system that are not currently accessing healthcare at all. So why is that bad, right? So it's not only at a health center, I think, but it may also impact the governmental action in many places at a state level, as a nation level. So this brings us to a last question, which is, how do you see AI being able to equalize access to healthcare, considering that there is a cost of development to it, obviously?
Well, I'm hopeful it will be able to do that, because it should be lower cost. I mean, once it is developed and it is available, it is something that we don't maybe have the human resources to give everybody immediate access to a human doctor or even a nurse practitioner, but these technologies may be able to be much more available. The diabetic retinopathy that Dr. Patel mentioned is a good example, where it requires a certain types of specialization that many clinics do not have, but now they do because they have the AI system. So I'm hopeful that this technology, both within the United States to our more rural parts, as well as, in our urban areas and so on, will expand access to good healthcare. But also, I think the point you made of internationally, I think is also critically important, that they are just not going to be able to afford these, $100,000 a year drugs and these very expensive machines. But maybe this technology, if it can be an app on a phone and so on, could be extremely accessible and greatly, increase a lot of our underutilized populations to get better healthcare.
I agree, and I think part of it is going to be public and private partnerships, and more economically prosperous countries like the United States have to recognize that we are the top 1% for the world, and we're going to have to actively work to reduce some of those inequities. We talk about top 1% in the U.S., but when you globally, the U.S. majority of the U.S. population is going to be the top 1% for the world, right? So I think we're going to have to work to help the others in the world as well, and that may mean that license some of the work people do for free. I hope that makes sense.
I think it makes perfect sense, and I think kind of collectively going to sort of closure of this. I think Dr. Patel, you named one thing very correct. AI has a PR issue, but I think kind of that maybe what the human has is the humbling issue, that we just discovered the force that can sort of effectively supplant us in a lot of ways. And we're a little bit in the position that we're trying to understand what is going to be our role as a doctors in the future. And, this is a little bit upsetting the balance. I think it should do a lot of soul searching. But I think we both here believe that the AI can do a lot of things better. And the question is, what do we do as a specialist? What is our value? So I think this will be a very, very nice closure to our session. I would like to thank you both panelists for a wonderful presentation and in-depth insight. I would like to also to thank all the organizers. We have Dr. Camps, we have Tyler. The person that we don't have is Dr. McDonald Linda. She's a little bit out for the health problems, but she was very instrumental in creating this this conference. And hopefully we're going to see all of us again in a year after the COVID. That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.